Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Who Has to Know or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by TrueFreak89, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Who Has to Know? Chapter 11. Scylla was going to kill Riel Collar. That one thought reverberated around her head as Riel's hand slipped further up her leg under the table, leaving Scylla to force herself to act like nothing was happening as Willa Collar asked her about her plans for next year. "I'm applying for Columbia," she said, keeping her features schooled as Riel's skillful fingers teased the inside of her thigh. Scylla really was going to take her fork and stab the other girl with it if she kept her teasing up for much longer. Scylla crossed her legs, but that only seemed to spur Riel on. Of course, the other girl looked the picture of innocence sitting beside her, quietly eating while her parents interrogated the hell out of Scylla under the veil of polite southern hospitality. Willa did most of the talking, with her husband Edwin choosing to stay silent and let his wife ask all the questions. He shot Scylla an apologetic look as he reached for his beer and gave a slight shrug of his shoulders like, "What can you do?" Scylla liked him. He held the same stoic air as Riel, but Scylla could tell from the gleam in his eyes that he was just as soft-hearted as his daughter. "Columbia? That's Ivy League, isn't it?" "Impressive." Willa clucked her tongue and Riel shrunk in her seat, anticipating a lecture about how she needed to pull her finger out and decided where she was going next year. Riel's parents didn't know she'd applied to several colleges already. She didn't want to burden them with the college fees if her search for a scholarship fell through. Her mother surprised her, though, switching from talk of school to more personal matters. "So, Scylla, do you have a special someone in your life?" she asked, and Riel almost choked on the juice she was drinking. Next to her, Scylla's cheeks blanched. She ran her tongue over her teeth before forcing a smile. "Yes, I do." Willa preened at the answer. Sure, she'd stumbled over some secret that her daughter was keeping from her, until Scylla added, "Porter, my boyfriend." "Oh?" said Willa, her eyebrows shooting up in her surprise, and Riel wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. Scylla knew how she felt. She avoided the older Collar's woman's gaze as she toyed with the food on the plate. "Well, that's wonderful," Willa recovered quickly. "And are the two of you serious?" "Mom!" Riel snapped. "What? I'm just making conversation, sweetie." Willa held her hands out. She knew her daughter all too well, and the reason behind her defensiveness, even if Riel herself hadn't figured it out yet. "That's okay," said Scylla, trying to calm the situation down. We've been dating for close to 2 years, but we've been friends forever. I can't imagine my life without him in it." It was the truth. It just wasn't the whole truth. Scylla stiffened as Riel pulled her hand back from her leg and slumped against the table, leaning her head in her hand as she stabbed at her food. Willa frowned, turning her attention from Scylla to her daughter. "Ray, elbows off the table, please." Edwin Collar cleared his throat as he reached for his beer again. "Who's ready for pie?" "Sorry about that," Riel apologized once she and Scylla were up in her room, the door safely locked behind them. "It's fine. Your mom's nice, and dinner with your parents definitely beats dinner with Porters any time," said Scylla. Riel gave her a questioning look, but Scylla dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Forget about it. They're a lot, is all. Riel shrugged and looked away while biting her lip. Do you want to watch a movie or something? A movie? Scylla rose an eyebrow at the suggestion. She crossed the room and pulled on the bottom of Riel's shirt, tugging her closer. I thought from your display at dinner you'd figured out that I'm off my period. Yeah, I did. I just thought we could do something else for a change. Riel winced. That sounded lame even to her. She quickly covered with, My mom gave me so much pie I think I might puke if we did anything right now. You didn't have to eat it all. Scylla laughed at her, letting her t-shirt go and wandering over to the bed. She made herself comfortable, like it was an everyday thing for her to settle into Riel's bed. Riel felt a knot in her stomach, which had settled there since halfway through dinner, beginning to ease. She walked over to her desk to fetch her laptop. Any preference on the movie? You pick. You'll regret saying that, Riel grinned as she brought the laptop over to her bed and settled down beside Scylla, their arms brushing and their hips pressed together. How do you feel about car chases and things blowing up? The action movie Riel put on for them to watch was a dime a dozen, and for that Scylla was grateful. It was hard to keep track of what was happening in a movie with Riel pressed up beside her. The other girl's face was so expressive as she watched, her eyes widening at the blockbuster explosion sequences, and her jaw tightening as the bad guys closed in on the generic straight white male protagonist. Scylla couldn't help herself when she moved in halfway through the movie and pressed her lips to Riel's jaw. The other girl's eyes closed over as a soft sigh slipped past her lips. Scylla kissed her way along Riel's jaw, seeking her mouth, and the blonde eagerly turned to greet her with it, the movie forgotten and her laptop discarded on the bed beside them. Riel moved so she was lying on top of the girl, pushing her back onto the mattress with a smirk as Scylla's hands wrapped around her neck. You didn't even make it halfway. You're definitely some kind of sex addict. Scylla was addicted to something, not that she would admit it out loud. She bit at Riel's bottom lip in response, making Riel groan into her mouth and urging her hands to wander. And are you kidding me with wearing this skirt to dinner? Riel teased, one hand running under the offending skirt and touching Scylla through her tights. Scylla arched into her touch, craving more. I didn't know I was having dinner, Scylla argued, her teeth nipping at Riel's ear as the other girl's mouth latched onto her throat. And you were the one who couldn't keep your hands to yourself. Can you blame me? Riel muttered, the words vibrating against Scylla's skin. It had been far too long since she'd had the other girl underneath her, and Riel intended to make the most of it. She pulled Scylla's shirt up over her head and tossed it aside before shifting to rain kisses down on Scylla's bare stomach. The other girl laughed as Riel's tongue tickled against her skin, and then hissed as she nipped playfully at her hip bone. Riel looked up at her with a goofy grin, running the flat of her tongue over the bite to soothe it. Scylla threw her head back onto Riel's pillow, squeezing her eyes shut and grinding her legs together as her body reacted to the other girl's touch. She felt Riel's hand slip around the back of her to undo her bra clasp, and soon enough the air bit at her bare breasts, making her nipples stand to attention. Riel took one in her mouth and Scylla's mind went blank. Riel slipped down Scylla's tights and her skirt next, all without her mouth breaking contact with the other girl's breast. She sat back to pull Scylla's tights off her feet and spotted the lacy black panties she'd been wearing in her earlier photo. Riel licked at her lips, which suddenly felt dry, and dipped her head to kiss Scylla over her panties. The other girl twisted impatiently beneath her and tried to push Riel's mouth to where she needed it most. Riel chuckled, the sound thick at the back of her throat as she moved up to return her attention to Scylla's breasts. She alternated between them, her mouth taking in a nipple while her hand saw to the other, pinching it and rolling it between her fingers, drawing breathy moans from the girl beneath her. Scylla rolled her hips, grinding up against Riel in the hopes of getting some much-needed friction. This felt different to all the other times they'd hooked up. It was too slow, too intimate, and Scylla didn't want to think about why or what that meant. She pulled Riel's shirt up over her shoulders, exposing her back to Scylla's nails as she ran them over her shoulder blades. They were cropped short, but still left fiery red scratches in their wake on Riel's porcelain skin. She hissed, biting down on Scylla's nipple in a way that made the other girl's hips shoot up. Riel got the message loud and clear. This was sex. They weren't making love. Riel moved to pin Scylla's hands above her head with a grunt, her hips grinding down to meet Scylla's as she nipped and sucked at her neck. Scylla was so far gone she didn't care if it left a mark. Riel kept Scylla's hands pinned in a place with one hand as the other slipped between their bodies and pressed its way between Scylla's legs. She slipped 2 digits inside of the other girl without preamble. Scylla was so wet that she hungrily swallowed Riel's fingers with no resistance, while a month ago she had struggled to take just one. Scylla squeezed her eyes shut again, brushing aside thoughts of how the girl on top of her had taken her virginity without even knowing it. Their drunken fumble in Bellwether's bathroom was hardly something to get sentimental about. Scylla rode Riel's fingers as she curled them inside of her, sending her closer and closer to the edge. Scylla's body was like a lit firework, ready to go off any second. "Riel!" she gasped, as the other girl pulled her fingers out of her completely, leaving her painfully unfulfilled with her orgasm just out of reach. She bucked her hips up, chasing after Riel's nimble fingers as she struggled against a hand still holding her wrists in place above her head. She'd never hated Riel Collar more in that moment, and then Riel's fingers were teasing at her folds again. Scylla almost purred at the much-needed contact, but the feeling quickly turned sour as she realized Riel had no intention of entering her again. "Bad girls don't get to come, Syl," Riel breathed in her ear in a sultry whisper, and Scylla almost came right then and there. She whined, trying to wiggle free of Riel's grip even as she turned her head to find the blonde's mouth. Riel eagerly kissed her back, but her fingers still hovered at her entrance, refusing to give her what she needed. "Ray, please." "Do you want to come, baby?" Shivers ran up and down Scylla's spine. She wanted it more than she'd ever wanted anything else in her life, and Riel knew it. "Riel, please." Riel licked her lips, amused at the sight of the great Scylla Ramshorn writhing beneath her and begging to let her come, and also extremely turned on. She could listen to Scylla beg her all day, with her cheeks flushed and her expression desperate as she tried to grind against Riel's hand. Riel's heart hammered in her chest. Knowing the power she had over the other girl was intoxicating. She'd only meant to tease her for a bit, a way of getting her back for the marks she had surely left on her back. But things had got out of hand, and now Riel had other ideas. "I asked," Riel teased, a single finger inside of Scylla, not enough to give her any kind of release. "Do you want to come?" "Yes," Scylla gasped, her walls clenching around Riel's finger as she ground her hips, desperate for the relief Riel was denying her. "Yes? And what will you do to come?" Riel asked, her voice a tone lower than usual and doing things to Scylla that couldn't be explained by science. "Anything," Scylla panted as Riel's thumb found her clit and rubbed it in teasing circles that only served to send her mad. "Okay then," Scylla sighed, a breath of relief. It was short-lived as Riel pulled her hand away completely and rolled onto her side, propping herself up on one elbow. Scylla's eyes widened. Without the other girl holding her wrist down, she was free to roll over and reach for Riel. If she wanted Scylla to make her come first, that was fine. She'd be happy to give the blonde a taste of her own medicine. Besides, Riel couldn't stop her from seeing to her own needs at the same time. Riel shook her head and leaned back as Scylla reached for her, looking completely at ease. A direct contrast to the pent-up mess Scylla felt. She frowned. What the hell did Riel want from her? As if reading her mind, Riel said, "I want you to make yourself come." Scylla's cheeks grew flush with color as Riel's words went right to her core. She clenched her legs together. Feeling the overwhelming slickness already there, she bit down on her lip. "What?" she finally said, feigning ignorance. She knew exactly what Riel was asking her to do. She just wanted to hear her say it. "I said, if you want to come, then you're going to have to do it yourself," Riel grinned, her tone commanding, and if Scylla was being honest, extremely sexy. Despite how turned on she was, Scylla felt a flush of embarrassment. She'd never played with herself in front of anyone before. But then there were a lot of firsts she'd share with the other girl lying beside her. "I want to see you." Riel's voice sounded a little less confident this time as she took in Scylla's apprehension, and a flicker of doubt in her oh-so-expressive baby blue eyes gave away her insecurities about her request. Scylla reached out, her hand lingering on Riel's cheek, and her fingers running over the faded scar there. She'd never asked Riel how she got it, but she wanted to. It was one of the 1,000 things she'd wanted to ask the other girl, things she was far too afraid to voice. Instead, she pressed her mouth to Riel's before laying back down and closing her eyes as she dipped her own hand between her legs. She tried to ignore the fact that she had an audience, although, truth be told, the thought of sharing something so intimate with Riel took her breath away and set her heart racing. It didn't take long for Scylla's self-consciousness to disappear, not when she had 2 fingers buried inside of herself, building her back up to the orgasm Riel had so cruelly denied her. She gasped as she pinched at her own nipple, lost in the sensation building inside of her. Even with her eyes closed, she could feel Riel's heavy gaze on her body, watching her closely. Leaning over the other girl, Riel was enthralled by the sight before her. Scylla's skin was flushed, her brow slick with sweat as her hips bucked against her own fingers, chasing her release. Unable to hold out any longer, Riel dipped her head, kissing Scylla as she reached out, thumbing her clit and making the other girl's hips stutter. Scylla kept going, though, and soon enough she was gasping and moaning into Riel's mouth as her long-awaited orgasm washed over her. Scylla rode it out and rolled onto her front, pushing Riel back and resting her head on her stomach as she gave out a shaky laugh. "Well, I don't think I need you anymore." Riel grinned as she ran her fingers through Scylla's hair. "Thank you for trusting me to do that." She pressed a kiss to her forehead. And it was really hot. Both girls fell into a fit of giggles, and Scylla buried her face against Riel's taut abs. Emboldened by her recent actions, she began pressing soft kisses to Riel's stomach, moving further down to her hips. Riel tensed beneath her with a sharp gasp. Scylla had never done that before, and Riel had never pressed her to. Despite her earlier request, she had never pushed Scylla into doing anything she was uncomfortable with. She knew the other girl was clearly bisexual, but she wasn't sure the extent of Scylla's experience with women. A small, greedy part of Riel wanted to be her first and her last. She pushed that thought out of her mind as she caught Scylla's eye. You don't have to." Riel's voice wavered, the commanding confidence from earlier having abandoned her completely. The corners of Scylla's mouth curled up in a bashful smile. "I want to. I've just never—" "It's okay." Riel reached out, her hand lingering as she brushed a lock of hair behind Scylla's ear. "I can talk you through it, if you want me to." Scylla bit her lips as she nodded and shifted lower. With anyone else, she might have been too proud to ask for help, though with anyone else, she wouldn't be lying there between their legs, contemplating eating them out. Riel propped herself up on her elbows, better to guide the other girl as Scylla swiftly undid Riel's jeans and pulled them down, along with her underwear. Riel pulled her shirt over her head and tossed it aside. Scylla was dressed only in her panties, and it hardly seemed fair to her for Riel to be so overdressed. Scylla dipped her head to kiss the inside of Riel's thighs, first one and then the other. Beneath her, Riel gave out a shaky breath. She couldn't remember ever being this nervous, not even during her first time. Scylla took her sweet time, getting Riel back for her earlier torment. She breathed in the other girl's sharp scent. She tasted Riel on her fingers, but never directly from the source. By the time Scylla's tongue swiped along the length of Riel's folds, she was fit to burst. Riel buried her fingers in Scylla's hair, mindful not to tug on it or push her head down. Riel didn't want to rush the other girl or spook her. Scylla gave a few more tentative licks, watching and listening as Riel responded positively, her hips canting against her mouth. "Harder, baby," Riel mumbled, both hands tangling themselves up in Scylla's hair. It wasn't the first time the moniker had slipped out, and Scylla's breast tightened at the sound of it. She did as Riel asked, swiping her tongue more firmly through the other girl's folds, before moving up to swirl it around the hood of Riel's clit. Riel moaned, her hips grinding up to meet her. Encouraged, Scylla buried her face between the other girl's legs and hummed as her tongue poked at Riel's entrance. Shit. Riel's grip on her hair tightened, tugging at the roots. Scylla didn't mind. She quite liked it. Her tongue pushed up inside of Riel as she tried to copy what Riel had done to her in the past. She wanted to make Riel feel as good as she'd made her feel. Scylla removed her tongue and replaced it with 2 fingers, burying them deep inside the other girl. Riel moaned, one of her legs slipping over Scylla's shoulder to make the angle just right. Scylla carried on licking and sucking as her fingers worked inside of her. Riel's gentle gasps and moans told her she was doing a good job. Syl, God, it feels so good. Scylla felt Riel shudder as the orgasm grew close. She moved to take Riel's clit in her mouth and sucked at it, ripping out a loud, satisfied moan from the other girl's throat as her orgasm hit. She kept going, licking and sucking as she saw Riel through her orgasm, until eventually Riel pushed her head away, her eyes and legs clenching shut as her body rocked with the aftershocks. Scylla sat up, wiping at her mouth with the back of her hand. She reached behind her and pulled Riel's comforter over both of them as she lay down beside Riel. "Pretty good first attempt," Riel laughed, her pupils blown as she opened her eyes and rolled onto her side to grin at Scylla. "Thank you. I had an excellent teacher." Riel's grin widened and then faltered. "Wait, you meant me, right?" "Yes, Ray, I meant you," she laughed, dipping her head to kiss her. "Should we go back to the movie?" "Nope." Riel popped the pea as she rolled over so she was lying on top of her, their bodies flush, and her hand snaking between Scylla's legs. "I've got a better idea." Scylla giggled as they kissed again. "Now who's the sex addict?" Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.